Welcome to this session. My name is Lori Van Egren. I am the Vice Provost for Public Engagement in the Office for Public Engagement here at the University of Minnesota. And welcome to this session as part of Research Ethics Week. We're very, very excited to present this panel, which is on ethics and the engaged scholar. We know that there are a lot of issues that arise doing community engagement, and most of those have to do with ethics around researching with populations that are often marginalized, and just all the kinds of things that go in regular research can be magnified when you're doing it with communities and through a truly engaged lens. So we have a wonderful panel that I'm very excited to have here. And I will introduce them, and then I'm going to sit back and if you would like to say more about your background or your positions, we will go into the session after I mention who everybody is. So here we have from the School of Social Work, Assistant Professor Saida Abdi, who is a 2022 Urban Research and Outreach and Engagement Center, which is UROC, Research Agenda grant recipient, and who works on cultural adaptation of trauma systems for immigrant and refugee youth. So welcome, Professor Abdi. We have Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, or CURA, Director of Community-Based Research, C. Terrence Anderson, who supports faculty, staff, and students engaging in community-based research. And then we have School of Nursing Associate Professor Lauren Martin, whose nationally known research on sex trafficking and the Minnesota Youth Sex Trading Project is supported by students in the Center for Community Engaged Learning's Community Engaged Scholars Program. So welcome to all of our panelists. As we go along, you can put questions in the Q&A, and we're going to go through some different questions, allow our panelists to respond, and then have questions and answers. And if you all want to change that format in any way, feel free. But let's go ahead and start. And our first question is, well, it's not actually a question, but can you give us an orientation to the communities that you're working with through your engaged research and sort of your position along with those communities, how you've engaged them? Give us a little background. And why don't we start with Saida?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for everyone who's attending and all the organizers. So I'm originally from Somalia. First of all, my name is Saida Abdi. I'm assistant professor in the School of Social Work. My research focuses on what we call resilience and risk for refugee and immigrant youth. Essentially, how can we support refugee and immigrant youth? I am originally from Somalia, East Africa, so primarily I work for a long time with refugees from Somalia and from that region. But now in the project that Dr. Van Egren mentioned, I'm working actually with Somalis as well as Latinos. So the majority of the kids we serve in schools actually just by nature of who is coming as refugees and as migrants. We're working with Spanish-speaking children, Latino children, and I work also with the Afghan community. My work really is community-based. In every project I do, I partner with communities. I partner with community service providers. We ensure that our research team is reflective of the communities we're working with. And I've been honored and welcomed and supported by the communities. And that in itself is a huge responsibility. I hope that answers that question.
Great, thank you. Thank you. C. Terrence, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. It's great to be with everybody. Great to be on this fantastic panel with Dr. Martin, Dr. Abdi. It's great to see you both. So I'm C. Terrence Anderson, Director of Community-Based Research Programs here at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. It's got to be a shorter way to say that. I'll figure that out one day. Yes, I get a chance to do a lot of community-based research across the Twin Cities in the state of Minnesota, often delving into at least what I think is some pretty interesting public policy topics like housing, immigration rights, environmental justice, transportation, land use, and all sorts of other things. And so ultimately in the context of my work, it's about building capacity and community for them to own the issues that affect their lives. So I've even got a chance to work with Dr. Martin to some of this extent in our past work, which I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about today. But ultimately building that capacity, building the knowledge structure and our structure for delivering knowledge and hearing knowledge in the course of deciding some really important things is the work that we do. So we've got a fantastic staff over here at Kira. I see Vanessa Voller, who is someone we used to get a chance to work with here at Kira, is in the audience as well too. And I think we've delivered a pretty powerful body of work that I think has changed some great things here in Minnesota. So it's great to be here today and looking forward to really diving in.
Thanks. And then Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm actually super excited to hear what Saida and Terrence have to say. So I think this is going to be exciting. Anyway, a little more about me. So as you said, I work on issues related to sex trading, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. As you can imagine, these are actually really tough projects for students to engage in. Just because there's, we're working oftentimes with people who have lived experience in some form of involvement in transactional sex. So there's a high probability or high risk for traumatizing people or doing things that are harmful when we're trying to be helpful, right? So there's, so I think a lot about how can students engage in this work in ways that are safe for partners that I've been working with for a long time, for participants in projects, and for themselves. Because there's also, there can be challenges around secondary trauma. Kind of like what Saida said, I try to work with people who are close to the issue. So just being very mindful about what that means. But a little bit about who I work with. So like I said, I work a lot with people with lived experience, engaging them in designing research from the beginning, like what questions are we asking? How are we doing the projects? How are we minimizing harm? Those kind of things. But I also work with service providers, housing, police and law enforcement, because they're part of the issue, looking at communities that are most impacted. So I do a lot of work with communities of color, indigenous communities, tribal communities, really building what are the questions that we need to ask, and what are how does our collective knowledge creation need to flow into action? So I feel like without engaging those broad constituencies, it's really hard to even conceptualize what might be helpful or needed. So anyway, that's a little bit about the communities that I work with.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. You are all working in extremely complex situations. And I think, we can get right to what some of the ethical challenges are that you've encountered. And I think it's helpful to know what the challenge was and how you addressed it, but it's also instructive to know what didn't go great. So, if you can give us both things that were handled well, and things that it could be yours, it could be things that you've seen others do with a very, anonymized approach. But it's I always find it really helpful to learn from mistakes as well. So I'm just going to open it up to the three of you and let this be because I think you're going to want to talk to each other too. So feel free to have a conversation as you're going forward. And I'm just opening it up.
Well, I could speak to one and maybe then we go around. I think just the power imbalance between the university and the communities is, so when I am, because the way I look, and especially when I work with East African communities, one of the, reasons why I've been so successful in working with communities is because they see my positionality. They see me as someone who is from the community and so the trust they put in me is a trust based on that relationship. And I have to be very careful how that trust is used and that they understand I am also a university professor. And so that whole process, even something as simple as informed consent, may take much longer time for me to process because I want to make sure they understand what that is. I don't want them to say, yes, we actually have this saying where is this the Somali? Yes, which is, I respect you, Saida, so I'm going to say yes, or it's yes based on understanding of what is involved in this work. And so often someone may say yes to be initially, and then I have to slow that process down to make sure they know what the yes is involved. The other thing, I think something that also Lauren mentioned is that really ensuring, one of the things I'm most proud of is that I never helicopter into a community to collect the data and leave, that the community gets the benefit. And so ensuring that there is a long-term gain that addresses the issues that we're studying, that we don't just collect the data about an issue and don't leave. And so really forming long-term relationships with communities, coming back, ensuring they benefit from the outcomes of that data, because often researchers benefit because we get more grants and we get more contracts and we make good promotion, but ensuring that the communities also benefit. So that those are things that have been, and the way I've handled, and yes, there have been times when things were so slow that people said, you know, we never want to work with a university again because we have to go through these processes. But the way I've handled is actually to work at the community base. And if that doesn't work for that research, I'm fine with that. I can deal, I can accept those limits, but that they drive and I don't. That if I cannot work at that pace, then I have no business doing that research.
I can jump in because Saida, something you said really spurred some thinking. You know, we kind of knew a little bit what we might be talking about. So, but something that you said spurred me like off my pre-thought through ideas, which is awesome. So, you know, when I do my research, I have a very different positionality often with the communities that I'm working with. You know, I'm a white person and I often work with communities of color and indigenous communities. So there's the trust piece is a different starting point. And it's a different kind of building block, but the principles are the same. It's about relationships. How do we build the relationship? How do we sustain the relationship? How do we build toward long-term partnerships? And for me, the way that I try to do that is by embracing who I am as a person, not pretending to be someone I'm not, really embracing who I am, who my experiences are, showing up as a real person, not as like some sort of fake person that I think people might want to see, right? So like, I don't show up as like a university, you know, hi, I'm Dr. Martin. And I also don't show up being somebody that I'm not. I show up who I am. And so I think that's super important. And I was really struck. So I have a lot of long-term partnerships with people I've been working with. Sometimes it's crazy to think it's been almost 20 years. And so that the challenge that you were talking about. So when I'm working with long-term partners, I will say, oh, hey, I got a new project. We're thinking about this. And sometimes they'll be like, oh, yeah, if you're doing it, yeah, let's do it. And I'm like, wait, hold on. I actually need you to be super skeptical. And I need you to ask hard questions. Because if you don't, you know, that's like part of how I keep myself accountable is by these long-term relationships where people, you know, have the trust and the feeling, oh, I can tell Lauren that I can tell you that you made a mistake, or I can say something that's hard because we have this relationship and you're not going to just leave the minute something gets hard. So I was really struck, you know, coming from a different positionality, but the principles around relationship and how we manage long-term trusting relations, you know, in community-based work, we often talk about what's those first steps, right? You know, how do you build trust initially, which of course is critical. But then we don't talk about how do you maintain an ethical practice through long-term relationships where there's a different ethic that has to come into play in a certain way. I don't know.
No, I think you're exactly right, Dr. Martin. I think both of you brought up what I initially thought about, thinking about positionality, both from our lens of working at the university, as well as our lens as individuals. And I think that maintenance of, so I think, you know, my own identity gets me in a lot of doors, you know, of, you know, initially, I think perhaps like Dr. Abdi was communicating, as an Afro-Latino person living in North Minneapolis, like I'm talking to my neighbors most often time in the context of the work. So I'll get in the door perhaps in different ways than you might, Dr. Martin, though you've had long relationships in the same neighborhoods that I have. So maybe that's not a great example, but just in general, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm operating with an ethic that will maintain those relationships in a way. And I think that's where I have to think about my positionality of working at the University of Minnesota, which is a power institution. And I think we do have to recognize has caused harms in the communities that the three of us work in, right? And I can't disassociate myself as an individual from this institution, right? So it means that I somewhat take responsibility in some way for what the rest of the institution has done. I particularly think about this in the context with tribal and indigenous communities, right? Which there's a long history of harm and all of us are responsible for, even if we individually didn't sort of commit those harms in it. And so thinking about that as a power institution, we really have to think about the way in which we construct our projects, right? I think to something that you said earlier, Dr. Martin, which was how we think about the questions or the hypothesis or the tools that we're using, or even ultimately what we're going to do with this knowledge that we gain or that we produce out of the work that we're doing. What we think a lot about at Kira is about, it's not our research agenda, it's community's research agenda. It's their questions that we're even focusing on. And it's to their aims that this work is being used. Of course, publishing this work is important for the broader production of knowledge, but I think our distinct focus is, does this work lead to greater agency for these folks and issues that affect them, for us at Kira, right? And so whether that's around the Blue Line or, any of the different things that we've been working on that you might go on our website at any particular time and do. And I know a lot of my colleagues at Kira think about that as well, too. But I think the piece that I really think about that's a challenge in that is, right, we just have to think about funding as a distinct way of power within our projects, right? So we're chasing funding from other power institutions, whether that's governments or philanthropy, who have their own lens about what they think should be done that might be counter to the folks that we're trying to build trust and relationship within community. So I think that's always a challenge that we find in doing our work, but I think it's my job, it's our job at the university, who is another power institution, to be able to broker and facilitate with community for their ends and for what they find to be important, to be centered in those projects when those other institutions that are funding us might feel different than. And then it's sort of taking that knowledge, not just for their ends, but to also change and create change in those organizations as well, too. So I've seen that in our relationship with the McKnight Foundation or within any level of governments that we work with as well, too. So that's what's gone well. What's gone poorly, to what you're saying, Lori, was, I always feel, we work at our own time at the university, often on the semester system. And I think, often folks talk about this moving at the speed of trust. That often can be a real challenge and can be a real scrunch in doing our projects, who might be very time-based in the context of the funders that we get. So how do we move at the speed of trust, at the same time moving at the speed that these projects need to? And I think that's gone well, and it's gone poorly sometimes in the context of work that we're doing. And so I think what I've learned from that is how to manage time with our funders, and like how to expect, look, there's going to be this period where we're not even doing research, we're just building trust. And that needs to be part of this process as well, too. So yeah, those are some of the things I'm thinking about often, other than lifting up what Saida and Lauren are lifting up here as well.
Lori, I would like to add two more things to this, just because I really don't want to, and I think everyone said it, but clearly, one of the, I think, the greatest ethical challenges for me is around funding allocation, how we divide. As a university, money that comes through universities, as you know, what happens is there's the overhead that's taken off initially, then there's our high salaries. And before it gets to the community, the money, more than half, most of the money is actually gone. And I really think, I know other institutions where I've worked have had community-based project rates that are different, where that those are reduced. So one is really, how can we ethically divide the funding? I personally feel I ask my community partners to do most of the work, and then most of the funding stays at the university. And that's unethical in itself. And that's something I don't have as much power as I would like. The second thing is just to think about not only how we collect and how we design, but how we disseminate research, and to continue after we are done with the collection. In other words, they have done everything for us and given us this powerful tool, that we're ensuring that voice continues to be involved in the analysis and in the dissemination, and they still maintain that power over our data as we started, and to make sure we're not doing any harm with the data itself.
Yeah, I think Saida and Terrence, you both brought up some really, I think we think about like university procedures as somehow logistical, but I would want us to think about them as having ethical components as well. So if we think about like with the example that you just raised, Saida, about funding and how funding flows, there's an ethic behind that. There's ethical implications for that about who gets compensated at what rates and how much. And then of course there's, you know, ethical consideration. You know, we have contracts and we have grant contracts, and those things spell out who owns what. And those are not just contracts. There's an ethic there about who gets to own that data. And so part of how I view my role, and this maybe comes from my past role as director of research at UROC, a big piece of what we did was really think about how do we transform the way that university and community work by looking at these little granular things that are not actually little. They might be granular, but they are not little. And how do we bring a different ethic to them? So you had asked about things that went well and things that didn't go well. I can think about many contract negotiations that I've had. I'll give an example that I think went really well. I was hired by the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center to do a benefit cost study on what would the cost of investing in a prevention program for youth to prevent them from getting involved in sex trading and exploitation. Like what would the, you know, there's cost to that, but then what's the cost benefit of that? So I worked with an economist named Rick Lotspeech, and it was Suzanne Keplinger at Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. She hired us, and this was in the time in the space when the safe harbor legislation in Minnesota was, it had been passed. And so this is decriminalizing youth involved in transactional sex and providing services and supports. And that the state was determining, are we actually going to invest money into a state-funded system to help young people? And so Suzanne thought, I think what we need here is a cost benefit analysis so that we can speak to these legislators. And I was like, yeah, this sounds great. Let's do it. We have an economist. It took us months and months to negotiate that contract because Suzanne rightly said, I'm commissioning this. Our agency should be able to use the findings of this. We should have co-ownership. So we worked for a very long time with the Office of General Counsel, wordsmithing and line iteming and making a contract that actually worked. Like we were able to make it work. So that actually, I felt like that one, Suzanne was an outside partner pushing. And I was like, yeah, you have to, you know, this was a case where a long-term partner, I needed the push because without her, it just wouldn't have worked to make that contract what it really needed to be. So that was one example of this sort of like logistical ethics. And how do we get our logistics to line up with our ethical commitments? I don't know. There's so many that didn't work. How to explain it? Sometimes the hurdles are too hard to overcome. Terrence, I loved your quote, and I think it's like a quote, it's a quotable quote, moving at the speed of trust. Oftentimes these contract negotiations really can stall the ability to build trust. And it's like you said, there might be trust with me as a person, but I can't act independently I'm not an independent person. My responsibilities and my, I'm tethered to the university and the processes and procedures that we have. So I don't know, but those are just some thoughts I've had. I'll kick another ethical piece in, and then I'll mute again and see what other people think. So of course, in the research, like you said, Lori, at the beginning, all the normal ethical stuff comes into play about informed consent and all that. But I feel like there's two things that are different in my work that I think about that are not necessarily part of an IRB application. And one is this idea about when we're doing community-based work, we're deeply connected with partners, and those partners also have positionality, and they have perspectives and experience, and they don't necessarily speak for everyone who has that experience. So in my case, people involved in transactional sex have a wide range of experiences, and whoever I'm partnering with at any given moment, at any given project, might be bringing a different perspective to bear. And so it's really important that I don't say, okay, this speaks for everyone. Just being very situational and contextual, and how we think about the knowledge that we're creating together is one thought. I'm curious about what Saida and C. Terrence think. The other one, which is opening a huge can of worms, is just all the different ways that the process of research itself can be harmful. And that is, research is about extracting, building, generating, there's these words that we use, but it's about asking questions. And I will just say there's one person who I worked with for many years. We've had a lot of conversations about research. She has lived experience, and she talked a lot about how often she participated in research because she needed money. And she would tell me about other projects that she participated in. She'd be like, oh, I do research all the time. And, usually in her mind, she described most research as greedy, meaning that they ask too much, they ask too personal. And she said, and many other people echoed this, that participating in research, even with compensation, felt worse than transactional sex for her, because at least with the transactional sex that she had been involved in, they were just looking for this one thing. But with research, they were like, they're trying to get my soul. So it really, that was just it just, really hit me. And that conversation has really shaped how I think about doing research, what kinds of questions, what the research experience feels like. I don't ever want to be trying to get someone's soul, right? I want to be working to develop knowledge together. So I think, I don't know, I'm bringing up two ethical components that I think are really, that we care about in community-based work, that I'm really curious, Saida and C. Terrence, if you have experienced this or any thoughts. I don't know, maybe I'm overstepping because I know Lori's supposed to be asking the questions again.
This is great. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you brought up a lot there, Dr. Martin, but I think, one thing that really struck out to me from what you said was, of course, we have processes at the university. We've got guideposts about how to sort of stay in ethical frameworks. For example, of course, IRB being perhaps the largest. I think what we talk a lot about in community-based research programs at Kira is those are really the minimum ethical considerations for us. They're not the maximum ethical consideration. And often ethics and community, as we might define them, go above and beyond the minimum legal frameworks that we have to follow here at the university. And even sometimes the community ethical frameworks or sort of guidepost can sometimes be in conflict with so say about compensating participants. I think there's often a very different view, as you were sort of alluding to, Dr. Abdi. And so, I think it's, so then it's like, for us as community-based researchers, what's ethical standard are we sort of operating within? I think is a very present question that I'm asking myself. And I think that there's times, and, hopefully you feel good about this, Dr. Van Engren, where I'm sort of advocating from the community's perspective about where we need to change at the university. And it's ultimately out of what I feel is my responsibility is to reconcile the university and community to be on the same plane. Like in my specific world, in my context, but I know that my work will impact other researchers coming from the University of Minnesota to these same communities. And I'm trying to reconcile always. And that comes it comes down to how we operate. And frankly, you know, the universities processes and sort of guideposts for delivering research aren't often built for the community-based research context, right? They're built for these huge NHS grants or whatever. And right, there's a lot of things that I think are rightly being considered there, but that are just sort of too onerous in the context of doing a community-based research project, and sort of can instill that greater sense of fear within community, right? That the university is not trying to reconcile with me, right? You want me to run through all this process, which why? I just want to sort of be able to, you know, do what I want to do. And yeah, frankly, the questions that we ask, I hear what you're saying in that story about like, you're trying to take everything from me. What am I getting out of this? I think is a very just plain language way of saying what the experience is often. And I'm always just trying to reconcile that constantly and consistently and to understand more deeply community's ethics. So, you know, I think it's just a big point for us to continue to be reflective about rules as guideposts that were not necessarily written for what we're doing, and that we can take the responsibility to push on where it makes sense. And sometimes we get little bits of change. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to change the university's ways of processing NHS grants in order to do the community-based research projects that we're doing, but I hope the university can become more cognizant about the shifting ethics and greater expectations within community. I saw a significant shift in this post murder of George Floyd in our community, particularly around issues like compensation, particularly around issues of who owns the data, who owns the work product that we produce, right? The Twin Cities and Minnesota community made a significant leap about the desired agency that they have over work that's happening about them. I think that's a tremendously good thing in the context of the work that we're doing. And I'm not saying this as a failing of any individual person. I mean, we're a huge institution that's trying to account for a lot, but the institution has not been able to shift as quickly as community has, right? I think that's just true. We're big, right? And we move slow maybe for a particular reason. And for those reasons, that's good. But in this particular context, it's sort of eroding to trust and relationships with communities. So I think, you know, what is our process internally at the university to reflect on shifting ethics within community? Like, I don't think we should shift like the wind, because of course there's been a lot of really poor ethical standards set in different corners of community that I don't think that we should be as responsive to, right? And so I feel the own conflict with me as a person, depending on which community group we're talking about. So just as a general point, you know, what I'm really struck by what you're saying, Dr. Martin and Dr. Abdi, is just that we do feel that difference between the university's ethical standards, what I think are the minimum ethical standards, and the changing and shifting ethical standards within community that I think we need to be responsive to, particularly within the context of community-based research. I think my message, I guess, for the folks that are listening here today is it's okay to feel that tension and to live into that conflict, because the end product of that, I think, is reconciling with communities who have been historically disenfranchised from the space of the University of Minnesota, particularly within what the folks that three of us are working with.
I want to add one thing to this. Thank you, both of you. This is just such a great thing. And Terrence, thank you so much for articulating so well what I've been thinking for a long time. I worked in different spaces, not just in Minnesota. Before I came to the University of Minnesota, for example, I did a community-based project. Actually, the same model I'm doing here in Canada, where they have a community research ethics office that works with you. That's actually the board is made up of both people with scientific background and people with community backgrounds, so that they look at the research in a different way with that lens. I also sat at Harvard, sat in front of the advisory community, IRB, and felt like I don't think they have any idea about the work we do. You know, in trying to get an approval, because we're called to actually explain what we're doing. And for me, it's such a struggle. I did a project where here at UMN there, at the end, where we had to train every community member on IRB. We put them all through CT. And at the end of the report, when we asked them what was the most challenging thing, it was going through the university process was the most challenging thing. And I do think interrogating those systems, we are not ever going to compromise the safety of, because that's also our priority, but really having a community lens and ensuring that within the IRB process, that there are people and the knowledge of the community is brought in, so that when we are actually doing ethics reviews, we are asking whose ethics, like, are we actually doing more harm trying to protect than doing good? So that's just such an important thing for us to really think about.
This is fantastic. This is such an engaging conversation, and I'm very interested in what you're all saying. I think you were right on, hit the nail on the head when you said, Lauren, that these are treated as logistical issues, and they seem like they're small things, and because they're transactional often, right? They're about compliance a lot of the time. I mean, what we run into, I would say most often, is that in keeping with the compliance of the university procedures and processes, these become large ethical issues in doing community engaged practice. And we have a public engagement council that runs out of the Office for Public Engagement. And you're really affirming where I want to go with that council as we're convening, because what I've been hearing is that we really need to look at IRB. We really need to be able to think about, are there ways we can support our IRB reviewers and our IRB processes to help reviewers understand what the potential issues are related to community engaged research. So I really appreciate those. And, you're bringing up lots of kinds of issues that I hadn't thought about, like the effects of being, or the issues of being a long-term partner, and that your partners might just say that the trust is so strong that they'll just go with it. And, I think you have to be such a reflective researcher to say, wait a minute, I need you guys to question what we're doing. And that takes a lot of reflection and training, like reflection over time as a researcher, to think about that. So the logistical issues have really been coming up nationally too, in terms of, these are actually major things, and we've tended to go, it's the university, there's nothing we can do, this is so much bigger than we are. But at the same time, a lot of the time when you go and talk to folks, they can actually make some accommodations or changes. And so and you could also use these partnerships or use these contracts to, or whatever it is, to make change, because frequently our funders, especially maybe a foundation funder, don't realize that this is an issue, right? And so when you're bringing this back and saying, this is a problem for us, and our partners don't want to work with us under these conditions, but they want this to be funded, they want this to be, this is important for them, then you may have some leverage for change. As you were talking, it made me think about the role of community advisory boards, or the role of community IRBs. So if any of you have experience around that, or want to speak to how that can maybe be helpful in this process of making sure that our research is ethical. And this was not on the pre-question, so I'm throwing it out to you, but could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I didn't say I have as much experience with a formal community IRB, but let's just say, like, take that idea in its essence of a group of community members who are sort of holding projects accountable to having processes that are honoring to community culture and ways of being, and what we might broadly define as ethics, as well as sort of advising on the development and ongoing of the process. I think I have a lot of experience with. I actually really wish, and to shout it out, Vanessa Voller in the audience, I wish she was really here to answer this particular question, because I think she's excellent at this. But I think communities holds you accountable in lots of different ways that are untraditional to the university, which could mean getting a phone call at 10 o'clock at night saying, I really didn't like what was happening here. I'm just going to sit here and you're going to listen to me vent for the next hour, which I think is a form of IRB that we might honor. But it's also, I think, important about when we start asking the question is one of the most important things. I think both of the other panelists brought up these ideas about when and how we construct our projects matter, because we might decide for ourselves the same exact thing that such a board might construct, but that process being me making the decision versus we making the decision ultimately matters. I think one of the most fundamental steps that you can just sour the whole rest of the study is making that mistake of starting with me versus we, particularly in the context of community-based research. So I think if you get that step right, then that's when we might run into like, okay, well, I'm just going to trust the rest of this and I'm not really holding you accountable to it, because like that honestly is totally non-conditioned, particularly within communities of color. You got to think about that these are the same communities in which governments, for the most part, decide when to do a project, how to do a project, might have a community advisory committee in which they might share their ideas, but at best, mostly just host a 2-hour open house to say, hey, are we doing a good job? And whether you say you're doing a good job or not, they're probably just going to move forward and do what they're always going to do, right? That's actually the context that most folks are thinking about when doing research too, right? They're thinking about another big institution who has a question, who's trying to find an answer. And that's the closest example that they can really sort of draw into. And we know that there is tremendous amounts of trauma from communities of color and other marginalized community in that context. So starting with like, what is our question is perhaps the most powerful thing that we can do within the context of community-based research. How might we do that being secondary? And even if folks don't have an answer for that, the fact that you started with them for the question first, like, well, I think I hear what you're saying. I think we can do it this way. And then affirming it with that context, starting with them first, is just tremendously powerful. And it's so simple, right? It almost just like blows my mind how often we just don't do the simplest thing that builds the most amount of trust. And it's not just like this secret sauce that I have. It's just literally starting with, you're at the center of this project. You're the most impacted by what we can deliver it. So you should be the one constructing what we're doing here as not just a nice thing to do, but as an essential thing to do to deliver an ethical body of research that's powerful amongst a historically marginalized group of folks. So I don't know if I'm front-facing answering the question around IRB, because I think IRB is talking about a process, but I think what I'm sort of alluding to is the ethic by which IRB was constructed, and how that might show up differently in community. I think there are front-facing community advisory boards and project boards, but I think just like community that will manifest itself in community in so many other ways. That shows up in how many people show up to your meetings, whether people will actually take your survey, are different ways of community affirming and holding you accountable to whether you're doing this thing the right way or not. Or if you're getting that 10 p.m. phone call and someone's just chewing you out for an hour, then that's another way that folks might be really holding you accountable. And you just got to stay patient and listen in those moments.
I would like to add to what you're saying, Terrence. And so in over my 20 years of doing this research, I've had lots of different experiences with advisory groups or that function. And, sometimes I feel like, depending on the project, like a formalized advisory group with, quarterly meetings and blah, blah, blah. Like sometimes I think that is a good thing, but sometimes I think it can just become another procedural piece and that only certain people have time to show up to that. Or I often find that the 10 p.m., as you put it, chew out phone calls are very impactful in how the research happens. And to me, developing those relationships where we can kind of have those conversations about what matters, have I veered off? What are you getting out of this? Like those kind of conversations. So that almost more informal, I feel like are super impactful. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but centering the people who have the most experience in relation to the thing that you're working on in whatever way is most comfortable for the people that should be the ones driving the projects, to me is critical. So it's like a project by project basis, depending on what we're working on, how formal does a thing need to be. In terms of IRB, oh boy. I think there were some important words, compliance being one. I I would like to kick into our thinking about compliance, kick in stuff about gift cards, because, or more importantly than gift cards, that's just like, is actually properly paying people for their time, because oftentimes gift cards isn't a proper way to pay people, but there aren't other mechanisms, and even the gift card mechanism isn't great. So like, as a university, compliance, because there's tax implications. So like in my work, if I'm engaging with people who have lived experience, I can't collect information. No, they're anonymous. So I can't report their information for tax purposes, because the university has tax regulations about payments to people, even participants in research. So they want names so they can send them a whatever the form is for taxes. But I can't give them names because it's an anonymous study and they're engaged in something that it's currently illegal. So there's, I don't know, I'm taking us off course here. Maybe I should just mute, but I don't know, the advisory group conversation is so essential, but also it can be fraught, because what seems like a good idea might not be the right idea. I don't know. I'm gonna mute now. I don't know. Saida, I know you do this kind of, bring us home,
I
Saida.
agree with you. No, I agree with you about the cap. I mean, don't even get me started about payment mechanism and amounts and things like that, because that's gonna last the whole day. But the idea, when I mentioned that advisory, like the IRB, I was meeting about this project at Children's Hospital Harvard. One of the things was around how do we don't want to keep names. We're not going to take names. We're not going to take names. So how do we actually track people? And, you know, so but I think also something else that you mentioned, to me, is how do we not, when we're working with people who might be engaged in behaviors that are considered illegal, or who might actually have, as Terrence mentioned before, who have a very dangerous relationship, like that feel in danger by our institutions. And we're asking them questions that may harm them. And yet we're asked to collect certain information about them. How do we navigate that? I will mention, since the question was about, and how we, you know, I will always fall to the data is not as important as the person. So if I cannot protect the person, the data is not going to be collected. So that's just my fault line. The question about IRBs that are different. So I mentioned that I partner actually on the same project that we're doing right now here in these schools with Canadian teams, specifically in Ontario. We have both Ontario and also Alberta, but the Ontario team actually went through a community research ethics office. And they reported that was completely different experience than going through I can get more information, Lori, and email you from my colleagues around that.
That would be great. I would appreciate that. We've got a few minutes left, about 11 minutes, and I want to ask, this is a big question. And it's easy for us to come up with a lot of the challenges, and that's really important because we need to continue to surface and address those challenges. And I think we're, as a field, moving into a place where we're starting to have a little bit more leverage to be able to bring these conversations to those who do set the policies and the procedures of the university. But if we're thinking about how can we prepare our researchers better for the ethics involved, and you are all extremely attuned to caring for the person. The person is first, as you said. So, excuse me, Saida. And you know, it's hard when we come from, at least me, I'm a white lady from the Midwest, you know, kind of middle upper class, and it's easy for me to go, research, that's not a big deal. I mean, it's not, I love research, you know, and if that's not the right attitude, but that's probably where a lot of our researchers are sort of coming from. We love research. Why wouldn't somebody want to engage in research? And so not really necessarily thinking about all the kinds of, or being able to even comprehend yet the kinds of harm that can come from doing this kind of work. So how do we better prepare our researchers to be able to do this work? And I'm thinking from the graduate student through, you know, our mid-career faculty who are shifting into some community engagement. What do we need to do to help them understand the extent of this? And I know that you have to go and talk to people, right? Like that's the way you learn these things. But what are the things we could do? It may be out of the Office for Public Engagement that would be helpful.
So I've thought about this a lot in my just so for me, I view research as a form of practice. I don't view research as like a survey or a thing or a methodology. It's practice. And in when we're connecting with people, it doesn't just come like you're not just born with knowing how to do that. Like it's something you can learn. And it's something, yes, you learn by doing, but in my work, I can't allow people to learn while doing, because when you learn, you make mistakes, and people who are new to the thing could make mistakes that I've already made, and that I'm not I don't feel that that's right for anybody, because the student feels so I view my work with students almost as a form of apprenticeship in a way. So if this is practice, the way I work with students is first they go with me. And usually it doesn't matter if undergrad or graduate student, the first thing that usually people do, and Vanessa's here, she's working with me on a project and she will recognize this happened. The first thing that happens is come with and take notes, because we always need notes at meetings. So to me, that's when I've heard this from students, it's a really good way to learn. Like students don't want to be thrown into, say, an advisory group with people with lived experience and try to run it, right? Nobody wants to just be thrown in there like that. So taking notes, then, smaller steps toward leading. So it's very, for me, very hands-on. A lot of times I'm also super intentional, like, okay, when students first start to go out, I make sure they're working with partners who I've worked with a long time. And if something isn't, if something happens or whatever, I feel confident that that partner will be supportive and that they're also on board with this teaching idea. A lot of times the people I work with in long-term partnerships want students to do this kind of work. They're invested in the kind of changes that we're trying to make. So they're engaged in that teaching mode as well. So I kind of spread out the idea of who's raising up the next generation of community-based researchers. I made so many mistakes that we don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes, because whenever you're new to something, you're gonna, anyway, those are just some thoughts that I've had about the process for how I try to bring people into this work.
That also makes me, I'll let you go in just a sec, but that also makes me think of, is there a way to pay, have a set of community partners who are consultants around this work, who are willing to, sort of mentor students potentially along the way in doing some of this work. Sorry, go ahead.
And I'll just be as quickly as I can, because I want to get to you, Saida. I know you have something brilliant to say here. I just think about, Kira was created after the Plymouth Avenue riots or uprising in North Minneapolis, which I'm gonna get really philosophical and really quick here, right? Was a project of dehumanization towards folks in North Minneapolis, particularly Black folks in North Minneapolis. So I think in a lot of ways, what I frame up our work in Kira is it's about humanization, or in other words, finding and respecting the dignity of folks in our society who have been discounted and ignored in the creation of our community here in the Twin Cities. So I think about, what we're here to do, or what Kira is often here to do, is about building the capacity and uplifting the agency of folks, building up a sense of consent around issues that are really important to them. So then it's in that context that community-based research becomes important, right? If I think about this knowledge and agency spectrum, people who have more understanding about what happened to them and what they can do about that, what they can demand, the more they can exhibit their agency in their community around them to get us to this shared project, what we all want, which isn't to live in a Twin Cities society in which we have massive disparities between different groups of folks, right? And I think that begins with a process of humanization, which begins with building a sense of agency and community. So yes, to what Dr. Martin was saying, research is a practice that helps us get to there, but it's not the only practice that gets us there, right? But it gives us a sense of purpose about why we're doing this particular community-based research, which informs the way in which we show up to do it. So I think I can really ramble on about that, right? Teach a whole class about that exact thing. But that's my framing and context for what we're even doing here from the perspective of Kira. I think that's shared by the panelists that I'm up here with. But I think that gets folks excited about we're not just studying something to study something, to belabor something, to belabor something. We're here in order for folks to have consent and agency and issues that are really important to them. So that's how I'd answer it. Yeah.
Thank you both. I love what you both said, but I will also try to make sure, because we actually have 3 minutes or 4 minutes. I think for me, one of the things I really think about, and which goes back to how teaching and how do we, for example, mentor students and how we work with communities, is the idea we cannot transform people unless we transform systems. And so embedded in everything we do should be changing what does harm, what has done harm, what continues to do harm. And for me, I work with people who are passionate, who are committed. You cannot teach passion, you cannot commitment, you cannot teach humility. I choose my partners on those terms. I can teach a technique. I cannot teach a stance, a way to look at the world that says there is a lot wrong here. And our research hopefully will move the needle. Our research will move both not just the community, but institutional needles, individual needles, communal needles. And the way I work with my students is I will say this. The thing I'm most grateful for being in Minnesota, apart from communities that have welcomed me and embraced me and trusted me, is the students, the quality of students I work with. My PhD students are just daily, I think my partner in this project and I sort of have a grateful moment where we're so grateful for those opportunities to work with such an amazing people in the community and in our institutions. And I take responsibility to my students as well as I do to my community. In both, it is that I live it better, and I did not say this, but I will say this. One of the things I'm proud of the communities I've partnered in Massachusetts, in Maine, in Vermont, in Canada, each has now a huge center run by the agencies we partner with that service the community, that is able to access resources built on the research and work and partnerships. And I still continue to partner after 20 years in some of those cases, because that is really, it is building not only just capacity, but opening doors and then stepping away. I need to live, to be able to live and say, if I live, this is built so that they have those connections to the power centers, so that they can themselves get what they need without depending on me. I'm not going to hold the door. So I hope that actually stays within the parameters of your question.
I want to thank our panelists. This has been a fantastic panel. I've just really enjoyed it personally. It's one of the actually most interesting panels I've probably ever attended. So I just think this is fantastic. And I want to say to our attendees, these people are all phenomenal community engaged researchers and partners, but also you can be this too. If you don't feel like you're at this level, you feel like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. You absolutely can. But you can see that they're very invested and committed in this work and the kinds of things that you have to be so thoughtful about. I want to thank Amber Cameron from the Office of Public Engagement who pulled this panel together. Again, great job, Amber, as well as Tarek Abdelkader, who has been helping us with support. And everybody, again, thank you to our panelists, and we look forward to doing things like this again in the near future.